Hello, I'm Malcolm Haslett. What motivates somebody to become a local government councillor and a fundraiser for those less fortunate? Well, we'll find out more about those stories next on OurTime. And welcome to OurTime. Our very special guest on this episode of OurTime is David Wilkins. David, welcome, Wilkins.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you said to me just before we came to air, I don't know that my story is that interesting, but it is. It's very interesting. So let's start at the very beginning. You were born.
I was at Modbury Hospital, and then 18 months later my sister came along.
How dare she?
I know, we spent 18 years afterwards fighting with one another. And then we were placed under what's called guardianship of the minister, which
That
means...
was, how old were you then?
So I was 3 years old, my sister was 18 months. And
that's because your parents were...
My parents were quite young when they had both my sister and I. I certainly can't imagine having children at their age, but they made the ultimate decision that it was in our best interest.
Must have been tough.
Well, it certainly was, both on them and of course on us, but I certainly think that they made the right decision, and I certainly wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for that decision and the upbringing that I was very fortunate enough to have.
Yes, do you still have contact with them?
I most certainly do, and I think that that's really important and very lucky.
Well, we all need to know where we came from, I guess, but that can change the way you look at life generally. And we've had several people on the program in the past 11 years talking about exactly that subject, but as adults, not as somebody who was a child and now is an adult having gone through it. So can you just explain the effects it had on your life?
Look, I have to admit I was incredibly lucky that I and my sister, one, were placed together. Of course, we didn't think we were lucky at the time, but that we were placed together in the same careship, because often that's not the case. No. Siblings are separated. But secondly, that we were placed in a family environment for the duration of our care period, whereas often children are bounced around from home to home. We were lucky enough to stay in the same family environment.
So you were sort of adopted into a family situation.
We were. And
that remained and remains today?
That's right. So carers, Tina and Graham, who had 5 daughters of their own, just to keep things quiet in the household, ended up taking on my sister and I.
You were the only boy?
Only boy, but there was another boy who was taken in from another foster care arrangement.
So they were great people?
Growing up, absolutely.
And they are great people.
And in fact are still offering foster care to children today. So an enormous heart.
What do you think it is that makes parents want to do, or people want to do that? Because it can be any couple now.
Great question, and I think particularly when you've had 5 daughters of your own, the prospect of taking on even more children is enormous. But I think ultimately it comes down to that good intention and really wanting to make sure that children and young people have the best possible start in life, and of course that is around making sure that they've got that foundation in place, because you can't succeed at education, you can't thrive as an adult if you don't have those really fundamental things in place.
And love.
And love, absolutely. Fundamentally, that you've got that love and care and support, which we received in absolute bounds.
It's hard to explain that though, isn't it? It's hard to explain what does love actually mean in that situation. Like if your children are born of you sort of thing, it seems to be like a mental process that just goes on. But if they're not your children, you've got to sort of learn that child. Does that make sense?
You're spot on, Malcolm, and we were quite lucky in the sense that we were absolutely taken on as if we were their children. In fact, I refer to Tina and Graham as mum and dad still to today. Yeah. And in fact, we were treated exactly the same. So that didn't mean that because I was in foster care and another sibling wasn't, that we got out of doing the dishes on the weekend. We absolutely were treated exactly the same, and I think that that's an important foundation as well, that there isn't...
Well, I appreciate all those things. I was an adopted child as well, not with my sister, who is from another family as well. But the fact that in the 50s or late 40s actually, adoption was not really understood that well, and in a way I'm a bit sad that it isn't understood better today, and there aren't more opportunities for adoption. Would that have been a possibility for you, or was it always going to be a state care situation?
I'm not sure if it was an option available at that stage, but I think, it might have been. Having said that, I think, where I was placed and the opportunity and the upbringing that I had, I certainly wouldn't trade that for anything else.
No, it didn't make any difference to now your mum and dad.
No, that's right. But obviously, there are different connotations that come in terms of adoption versus foster care. But for us, it obviously worked.
So, before we get to what you're currently doing, what happened next? So you've grown up, you've gone to uni?
So I went to the local primary and high schools down at Christie's Beach in the southern suburbs of Adelaide, and then was lucky enough to earn a place at the University of Adelaide studying law. Managed to grind my way through as a law student and come out the end as a qualified lawyer, and then fell into student politics on campus at university, which then sparked a love of all things political.
Is political something that you can love?
Well, it certainly is for me, and it's...
What is it? Is it the personalities in politics, or is it the interpretation of the law?
For me, I think it's around what does it represent in terms of its purpose. What are you trying to achieve? What is it? What is your objective? What's your ambition? And certainly on my side of politics, the progressive side of politics, it's around the opportunities to change your community. That's what attracts me to the political arena.
But it's also, in our particular system, it's also freedom, which we often forget.
That's right.
And we forget we live in one of the freest countries in the world.
And of course, recent events in the global stage this week have reminded us of that privilege.
Opens your eyes to how lucky we are to live here.
It most certainly does.
Even with the coronavirus sort of sitting down on top of everybody, and we must all be sick of hearing that name, but even with that, and even with the lockdowns that we've all experienced, particularly in, New South Wales and in Victoria and shortly here in South Australia, politically, though, have the leaders in South Australia done a good job? Is that a fair question to ask you?
Oh, look, I think, all leaders around the world have had to grapple with the challenge of coronavirus, and I think we've been really lucky.
There's no rules, are there?
Well, there isn't, and of course we then have to be guided by the health advice, which I think we're quite lucky in that sense that all leaders, no matter what political persuasion, have been really guided by the health advice, which has kept us in good stead. Of course, there will be particular elements of that strategy that people will criticise, but I think for the whole part, we've been pretty lucky.
We're lucky to be able to criticise, to be frank.
We certainly are. Certainly are, that you're able to have, anti-lockdown freedom protest. You certainly wouldn't be able to enjoy that in every country.
Well, not in the one with the problems at the moment, no. So, you are attracted to politics, you suddenly start working within that environment. How did that come about?
That's right. Well, I ended up falling into my first full-time role as a electorate officer to the federal member for Adelaide, Kate Ellis. And that's where I sort of was able to learn the ropes of the political environment, had the privilege of travelling to Canberra to support Kate and deal with a lot of those very interesting times during the previous federal Labor government. One anecdote I'd love to share is I had the privilege of being able to sit with Julia Gillard's parents on the day that she was announced as our first female Prime Minister of Australia. Right. So we were supporting them as they had a whole range of media interest in them.
Oh, that's an interesting story, isn't it?
It certainly was, and you could certainly see that there was an enormous pride both on their faces around what their daughter had to endure. And
but that's the whole point, same as your life. You start small and things affect your life, and from that you grow.
Most certainly.
Then what happened?
So then managed to work my way through in terms of different roles, so working for other different ministers, moved to the South Australian government and worked for Transport Minister Stephen Mulligan, Communities and Social Inclusion Minister Zoe Bettison, and then finished up with our former Premier Jay Weatherill in his office as we were heading into the last state election here in South Australia, which of course Labor lost, but enormous to be able to be part of that campaign.
Do you think in politics at the moment there needs to be a lot more consideration on both parties for getting it right for the public? I think there's a general sort of consensus that if you do that, we're going to do that. If you do that, we're going to oppose you with that. I know the role of opposition is to keep them honest, whoever's in power, but the reality is I think it's becoming a bit sort of grating at the moment without thinking of a common goal and let's all work together to get through this. where politics suddenly become irrelevant, but the political structure of the country is relevant.
Oh, I think you're spot on, and
It's confusing.
Oh, it certainly is, and I think we've seen state premier versus state premier nitpicking between press conferences. I think
It's the
country
nitpicking that's annoying.
is really fed up with that. So of course there's a role for an opposition to hold the government to the day to account, but I think more and more they have an important role to play in terms of putting alternative policies and different ideas on the table and working constructively with the government of the day, because I think, as you've said, Malcolm...
Constructively is the word.
That's right. We just want people to fix the problems that are facing. It doesn't matter whether you're in government or opposition, just get on with it.
Now, your background is interesting to lead to where we're going to talk about next, and we'll be back to do that in just a moment. Welcome back. Our special guest is David Wilkins. David, so from working behind the scenes in a way in politics on a state level and for a moment on a federal level, now you're working in politics on an individual council level.
That's right. I have the enormous privilege of representing the good people of Semaphore on the City of Port Adelaide Enfield Council. And in fact, it was that experience that I've had at both a state and federal government level that I felt I had a skill set that was worthwhile offering to support my community.
Well, you knew how it worked. I guess that's a simple
Well, certainly
thing.
understood a little bit around it, but of course council is very unique in terms of how it operates, but certainly understanding how you go about affecting change, how you work with bureaucracy and other organisations to get the outcomes that you're seeking.
It is difficult, isn't it? Because if you've got a couple of people who think differently about something, it's how do you compromise until you can get the whole thing or part of the whole thing that you wanted.
That's absolutely right, and I'm amazed that there are 17 of us that sit around that table at council every Tuesday night, and I'm amazed that we're able to walk out and come up with a decision every week that benefits all of us.
Pies and drinks after? Do you have pies and drinks
No, all
after?
of that's cut. I think,
all that cut.
I think people have really understood that that's not that doesn't pass the pub test.
Not anymore, does it?
So
No.
all of that's passed, and to be honest, I'm eager to get home after a long council meeting.
I know, they go on all night sometimes.
They
Have you got a
certainly
curfew?
About 10:30 we tend to knock off, because I think after 3.5 hours it's very difficult to make good decisions, and of course we've had 500 pages worth of meeting agendas that we have to get through beforehand, so it's certainly an unenviable task.
Until you sit through a council meeting, you actually have no idea, how I have, and I do understand sort of how it works, and I find it absolutely fascinating. So I didn't ask you this before, and I don't know if it's an appropriate question to ask now, but is it costly to become a local member in a council?
No, it's one of the things that basically anybody can put their hand up and say they want to represent their community, unlike state and federal politics where of course there's a lot of money involved. And in fact, people can run a campaign on the smell of an oily rag. They create a social media page and put out some letters.
So is it more about personal time, the personal time that you put into canvassing?
That's right. It's about having that connection with your community, but also that there are people who are willing to support you to get elected to council.
Right. Was the law degree helpful?
I think so, in terms of understanding the way in which government works. I certainly don't know that I had too many people asking me for legal advice when I was door knocking, and I certainly wouldn't give it. But I think just understanding the way in which our government systems work is always handy to have.
What about within the council chamber? Is having that law logically in the back of your mind to sort of solve problems or address issues?
Absolutely, and I have already been marked as someone who will regularly ask questions at our council meeting, and my colleagues will often roll their eyes and groan.
Oh, he's had it
but
again.
It's because that analytical mind that is taught to you from a law degree that you're picking up the the incorrect figure in the report, or you're asking a question mark for something that hasn't been answered. And that's a really vital part of the role, in my view, is making sure that we're doing everything we can to make the best decisions for our community.
I absolutely get that. But your community, particularly you, have been very involved with the Hutt Street Centre as well.
We have. So the City of Port Adelaide Enfield Council has since 2015 been participating in their Walk a Mile in My Boots challenge, which is all about raising vital funds to support homelessness in South Australia.
Is there a lot of that within your council area because you've got Port Adelaide involved and you've got some of the probably lower socio-economical areas?
Yeah, so the last census data said that there were about 6,000 South Australians experiencing homelessness. That was back in 2016, of course. We'll have some new figures coming out after everyone's filled out their forms a few weeks ago. But certainly in our council area, you're spot on that there are more people who are experiencing homelessness or one level above that are facing the pressures of poverty.
That's frightening, isn't it, in a country that we live in that has so much of everything to offer?
Oh, look, I don't know about you, Malcolm, but the thought of not knowing where you're going to sleep at night is utterly terrifying. And in fact, it was the SBS program, Filthy Rich and Homelessness, that really brought it home for me when you've got celebrities going through that real life experience of what homelessness looks like.
And the emotion of that.
Oh, absolutely. You know, but also having to deal with people looking at you as if you're invisible and you're not a human being, that you don't exist, really changed my attitudes towards people.
It's funny you say that. It just made me very conscious of a situation in a local shopping centre supermarket that I go to. There's a guy who sits there almost all the time outside the supermarket, and you walk past and you don't acknowledge him. And some people obviously have and have given him a little bit of food or something on the way out. But you've just made me very aware that I must do that. I must acknowledge that he's there and exists.
And that's what the show really hammered home for me, is that, you know, often it's people just want to be acknowledged. They want to be asked how they're going. They're not necessarily looking for money. And of course, we've all got that stereotype in our mind of what a homeless person looks like.
I suppose that's true. Yes, that's very true.
Yeah, but it absolutely isn't. It's people who have been CEOs, people who have done law degrees, people who have been members of parliament, end up finding themselves in a scenario where they're then experiencing homelessness. And that's why services like the Hutt Street Centre are so vital to support.
Now, obviously, the centre is in Hutt Street.
That's right, yes, yeah. But of course, they're working with people right across the state in terms of the delivery of those services. I was fortunate enough to be able to tour their new facilities and to be able to see some of the great work that they're doing. It can even be simple things like the fact that they've got secure lockers so that people who are homeless can put their belongings in a secure locker so that they're not walking around and drawing attention to themselves, you know, while carrying that shopping bag of their goods.
So, David, with people that are in that situation, how do they actually get help? Is it they need to be proactive to make it happen, or is somebody actually seeing them in this situation saying, like, here, come here, we've got a place, we've got a bed?
Look, it's often a combination of the two, and that's why services like Hutt Street Centre are so vital, because they will not only provide you with the immediate support that you need in terms of, you know, access to food and shelter, but also things like, you know, being able to wash your clothes, store your belongings in those secure lockers, or wash yourself.
And I always think, it's an odd thing to say, but where do they go find a toilet? Where do they find a toilet?
All of those things that we take for granted.
Wash your hands.
But one of the things that we learned while on the tour that the Hutt Street Centre are supporting people is even things like being able to get access to identity documents. So, you know, being able to open a bank account, for example, you need ID documents for that. How do you do that if you're homeless? What address are you putting down? How do you receive a driver's licence or a proof of aged care?
I was pleased to see in Sydney they've got teams going out with COVID shots for people that are homeless, and the sheer number of people is extraordinary. Well, and we just take it for granted that we have a home.
Well, and in fact, the COVID pandemic has taught us that we can actually house homeless people, because, of course, at the height of the pandemic last year, we were placing those people in hotels. So in a country like Australia, we can actually solve the problem of homelessness, but it requires political will to do so.
So is this a local council situation, or is it state, or is it federal to you?
Look, I think it's all levels of government,
Yep.
and I think the most recent Productivity Commission inquiry indicated that we've all got to work together. Of course, primarily it sits at a federal and a state government level, but at a local level as well, we're often described as the closest to our communities because we're working with our residents on the ground every day. We've got an important role to play in terms of making sure that people are getting access to the services that they need, but also advocating on those important issues which benefit everyone.
So there's been quite a bit of conversation about too many councils. It all should be just one. Could you still service the community as well as you are if they were bigger, if more absorbed together?
So in a scenario where we're merging councils, you'd need to look at having councillors probably remunerated differently. As a local councillor at the moment, I'm considered a volunteer, so I have a full-time job outside of my role as an elected member.
And that's something people probably don't understand.
No, you know, and I try to make sure that I'm accessible as possible, but, you know, if I'm in a meeting for work, I can't answer that phone call or I can't respond to an email as quickly as possible. So if you are going to merge councils, you know, you probably need to make sure that, you know, the people who are sitting on those bodies are given the resources and the support that they need to do it. People think that I've got an office and staff. That's absolutely not the case. It's simply David at the end of a phone call or an email.
Phone call, yeah. And doing the nighttime meetings trying to save the world. We'll be back with a bit more talking to David in just a moment. We're with David Wilkins on this episode of OurTime. Almost time to say goodbye. Time goes so fast.
It most certainly
does. And so
does.
much to talk about for somebody who said, I don't think I've got an interesting story.
You've done a very good job of
No,
punching
you've
it
done
out
a
of
very
me.
good. You've had a very interesting life, David. That's the thing. So we're just saying. So you're right on the beachfront.
I certainly am.
Yes. So there's an issue in South Australia at the moment about the sand dunes that are along there, and people who have homes behind the sand dunes complaining that there's going to be a walkway put through or something. Is that?
So there's the state government is proposing to build a pipeline from Semaphore Park down to West Beach, and all of that is around trying to take some of the sand that has gone into the northern part of the beaches back down, because we're losing a lot of that sand.
It's costing a fortune every year to replace the sand, isn't it?
About $48 million a year that we
Who
spend.
knew?
Yes.
Just so we could walk on some sand to get our feet wet.
That's right.
I think I bring that up because these are the things that people don't often understand is going on, and that sort of figure is extraordinary when you think it's just shifting sand.
Well, and you're all paying for it in increased green waste levy that was then whacked onto council bills. So every South Australian is paying for that.
Similar in Victoria, I would imagine, because I think they've got the same issues there, moving sand backwards and forwards.
Well, I think right around the country we've got challenges in terms of...
But this is so we can still have beautiful beaches.
That's right, and there are a number of beaches in the southern part along our coastline that are really suffering from some of that coastal erosion, and if there isn't enough sand in the system back there, we will start to see that sand completely wipe away and then
frightening, isn't it?
Put challenges on all of the infrastructure that sits along that, so our roads and property.
That, of course, is the thing that we're trying to protect as well.
That's right.
So if I gave you $1 million, what would you do with it?
Well, I think given I'm on here talking up the work of the Hutt Street Centre, I think I'd have to say a big part of it would have to go to them and supporting people who are experiencing homelessness. I'm very fortunate to be in the position that I am, where I've got
look at your story though.
in.
But look at your story from the beginning through. I guess the things that happen to us when we're young, the people that bring us up, the people that give their examples to us, and we're really obliged to do those things to the new generation and for the new generation.
And that's certainly been my upbringing, and what motivates me to be involved in the political system is wanting to change the community around me. So it's not just about me, it's about, you know, the people that I live with.
It's really about everybody, isn't it?
It's
everybody sharing.
Yes.
David, it's been really lovely to meet you and to chat with you, and I really hope that's been interesting for you to understand a little bit more how councils and local government works. So, thanks again. Until next time on OurTime, remember we're all made from stardust, so keep yourself nice always, and we'll see you soon on OurTime.